to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
We did it, guys. We got the first win of the Matt Rule era. Yeah. You guys excited? No one called us and offered us tickets either. So I'm still waiting on that.
Oh, you're talking about
But you were still there to witness it.
Huskers.
I was there, and my neighbor I talked about this my neighbor he had the time of his life.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
thankful for that
Yeah, we brought our little neighbor boy and his dad, and it was so fun to watch. It's always fun, even if it's our own kids, but to watch somebody experience something for the first time that's just epic. And so that was such a joy. So just for those that were wondering, you are now filled in.
Wow.
Now who did they win against, though?
They won against Northern Illinois University.
Oh.
Is that a good team?
They beat Boston College.
Is that a good team?
Boston College is a pretty good team. Yeah. They just barely lost to the number 3 team last week, Florida State, at the end of the game. And so it's all subjective, when you get into that. But
True.
It was a win nonetheless. And they've got another game this week, and we're going to keep yelling,
Wow.
Go Big Red in my house,
All
or
right.
signing it like I taught you all as well.
Okay.
So,
Also, happy fall tomorrow.
Is it?
First day of fall.
happy
Wow.
fall, y'all.
But pumpkin spice is already out.
Yeah.
It's already
and
out. But
yeah.
tomorrow it's officially official.
Traffic is already crazy by producer Austin's house out there by Vala's.
People are getting their pumpkin patch on.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any voicemails or anything like that?
We do not have a voicemail. We had
Okay.
another person send us a text message. I would love. Could you remind them of the number just in case? I think people forgot.
Yes. Please leave us a voicemail. We'd love to hear your beautiful voice at 402-885-9930. That's 402-885-9930. Just put it in your contacts. Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Whatever you think about us, just give us
It
a
could
call.
be 3 a.m. You're in the Taco Bell drive-thru for some reason.
Yeah.
Just questioning your life choices, and you want to call in. Do it. Just,
I like that. Put it
Yeah.
in the phone, and then something crazy, because I think it's one of those things, something happens and you're like, oh, I should ask that question, but then you don't have the number. So
Save it.
It's a number you'd want to put in your phone is 402-885-9930.
there it is.
Yep.
Leave us a voicemail. But we do have a text message from someone, so
boy.
thank you for that. Here's the question.
Okay.
If you were to write a Christian romance novel, what would the plot be?
Christian
funny.
romance novel. Jess is ready.
Jess is ready.
I
She's
am
been
a
thinking about it.
sucker for Hallmark movies.
Yeah. This is worlds
So
colliding.
Is Hallmark mean
so-
Christian romance novel?
No. Listen, I
I'm
love
listening.
these kind of things. I love it. Okay, so I was at a conference. I was at a counseling conference last week, and there was a really an older kind of good-looking worship leader, and I started thinking about this.
You started thinking about this novel you're going
I
to
was
write about
he
him?
looks like somebody that would be in a Hallmark
Oh, okay.
movie. So it'd be maybe a worship leader that is hired new to a church.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a lady
I'm
that
typing this up.
her husband died 12 years ago, and she has a singing voice that maybe no one's ever noticed. And one time she was down in the church basement, and he's a new hire, and he's upstairs working, and he hears this song. See what I mean? I could do this all day.
Okay, yeah.
And they meet, and that's all it takes. But there has to be some kind of festival, church festival that's coming
Festival,
up.
yeah.
Done. That's selling millions.
It's very good. I need to know what happens. I'm guessing Candace
Something
Cameron
bad's gonna have to happen,
is
so,
cast in this.
There's going to be some misunderstanding around probably the festival, and she's going to think he doesn't want her to come, but he really wants her to.
Yeah. So I think Candace Cameron's in it, and then you have Corey Asbury.
I like Lacey
Could we-
Chabert
could we have-
personally. That's one of my.
Oh,
No,
okay.
it doesn't sound like Corey Asbury. It just sounds like Stephen Curtis Chapman age, though, right?
Oh, this is an
I don't
older.
know.
She's
He's- and
older, and
okay, so
she's
this-
widowed.
I'm not going to say who the guy was actually.
Okay.
He's semi-famous, I think.
Okay, so you don't want to.
Worship leader.
All
But
right.
anyways, that's kind of how mine would go.
All right. So
Do you want to add on to it? Because I didn't really finish it. Maybe that's easier than coming up with your own.
you got your own, Alex? You got your own story?
I don't have my own story. I mean, mine. Mine was thinking about, so what happened in my Christian romance novel also set the setting of a church.
Yeah.
And
is it about a worship leader?
A youth minister.
Oh, youth minister. Okay.
Yep, youth minister.
Uh-huh.
And the youth minister, young youth minister, very single because he just graduated from Bible college, and he's running a youth ministry event. And what happens is he ordered a lot of pizza for the youth ministry event from a pizza chain. I don't want to sponsor anybody.
Little Caesars.
And he realizes as he's going to serve the children that this pizza did not get sliced. So what does he do? He goes into the church kitchen where there is a pizza slicer.
Yeah.
And he goes hunting for the pizza slicer, but he cannot find the pizza slicer.
Ooh,
and so he goes running around the church looking for the pizza slicer because someone probably used it for a craft to cut the Play-Doh. So he goes into the kids ministry wing and he sees this beautiful gal. He obviously, the first thing he does while she's cutting the Play-Doh for the little kids is he looks at her hand, sees if there's a ring or not. He sees that there's no ring, and all of a sudden he volunteers to start cutting Play-Doh. He forgets that he's got a ministry event going on right now.
Right.
There's hungry kids. The lifetime version.
This is really good.
There's hungry kids, and eventually, he
where are we going with this?
He gives her some cheesy pickup line. He says to her, "Do you have any Band-Aids?" And she says, "No." Why? He said, "Because I scraped my knee falling for you."
Oh, okay. I'm gonna have to leave this part of the story.
Wow,
that was a really well thought out. I mean, the pizza cutter. I don't even know where to go. I'm going to put both of these ideas into ChatGPT though, and have books on Amazon.
I want people to know. I don't want people to link the two, even though I said I was a pizza cutter a couple weeks ago. I don't want people to think that was my story because that is not at all my romance story with my wife. So I don't want people to link the two together.
Well, we may have.
I was a youth pastor, and I did say I was a pizza cutter, but that is not our romance story.
Okay. Wow. These are all very good stories, and I'm looking forward to seeing them soon on Lifetime.
Let us know which one you would read.
Yeah. Which book is it?
Which book would you read, guests?
Yeah. I don't know. I would read it. I would watch it. I don't know. Whatever. Maybe it's a book and then it's made for TV. It's great. All right. Well, yeah, thank you. And if anybody else has any questions or they need help, maybe they have writer's block and they're looking for an idea, obviously we are a wealth of ideas here.
Amen.
But that's not what we're here for today. Today, we are going to be talking about navigating divorce when you're an adult child of divorce. So stay tuned for that one. All right, today we are joined by Jarrett. Hello, Jarrett. How are you?
Hi, Eric. I'm good. How are you?
All right. Jarrett, you're joining us today because we're going to be talking about pretty much when your parents get divorced and you're an adult. Maybe you've moved on a little bit with your life. You've moved out of the home.
Yep.
And your parents make a decision to separate. And that's something that you've personally experienced. And we thought, okay, let's get a perspective from someone who's gone through this, firsthand perspective. Also, tell people a little bit about who you are, why, how did we find you?
Yeah.
You're not just some random person we pulled off the street to be on the podcast.
So true. I was pretty close by when you found me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I serve as the online content manager at Christ Community Church here, working closely with Eric and Alex and producer Austin. I share an office with producer Austin. And yeah, as we walked through kind of looking at different family dynamics, was asked if I would come on and do this. And part of the fun with that is that I cut the clips for this podcast every week. So if you see a clip on social media and it says, "This week Jarrett joined us," know that I wrote that weirdly in third person.
Yeah, that's awkward. But I appreciate
it's uncomfortable,
it.
honestly.
Yeah. On brand. Yeah.
Can't wait till you have to listen to your own voice the whole time.
Oh, it's gonna be rough.
Nothing better than listening to your own voice. You're like, that's what I sound like? Are you kidding me?
I'm gonna cut like word by word and just piece together something that I didn't say at all.
This is exciting.
Yeah. All right. So that is kind of, it's a proximity thing, but thank you for being vulnerable with us today and sharing this. Why don't you kind of set the scene a little bit for us? Help us kind of understand your living situation, the timing of all of this, and help us understand that a little better.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Michigan, like right outside of Detroit. My mom worked for General Motors, and my dad did at one point. And then he was kind of throughout my childhood, my dad was working kind of all over the country. He worked for a company called Fast, and they did a lot of like implementation of systems for governments. And so wherever they had a project with that state government, he'd be out there. So kind of throughout my childhood, he was in Illinois for a while. He was in Montana, Washington State. And so kind of the typical rhythm of what that looked like for him was he was home about every other weekend for about 4 days. And then he'd head back to, for most of my kind of years that I remember, it was either Montana or Washington State. And so grew up, had one older brother who was very isolated. He very much kept to himself and was just kind of in his room. And so a lot of my childhood was just kind of me and my mom. My brother was in his room. My dad was often just out of the state on work. And so kind of grew up me and my mom and walked through that process. And when I was 18, went to the University of Michigan and started going there. And it was after my first semester of college, so coming home on winter break. Kind of a crazy sequence of events. I woke up one morning and I couldn't breathe. I just had a bunch of pain in my chest, and I was like, I don't know what this is. So went to the bathroom, did the classic self-diagnosis, Googling what's wrong with me.
What did you have? By Google, what did Google tell you was wrong with you?
I don't know. I couldn't find anything that was super helpful, but it was just see if this goes away. And so I just kind of waited for about 20 minutes and it didn't go away. And so I went and woke up my dad, who had been, for the last 4 years, sleeping in our guest bedroom. And I was just like, hey, Dad, I can't breathe, which is what probably every parent wants to wake up to, is their child telling them that they can't breathe. And so we went to the ER. We were there for a couple hours. They ran a bunch of tests. Couldn't really figure out what was wrong with me. After a couple hours, it went away. And so they were just like, hey, if this comes up again, you can come back, but we don't really know what's wrong with you. And so for me, I was like, yep. If I can't breathe, I will be coming back. But left that, came home, and my mom also kind of trying to diagnose what's going on here. Kind of the conclusion she came to was, oh, he's figured out that me and his father are getting a divorce. And so later that day, they sat me and my brother down and told us that they were getting a divorce. And that was an interesting time for me too. When they told us, oh, we want to sit down, we have something serious we want to talk about. Both my parents' mothers had cancer maybe 3 or 4 years prior, and my dad's mom had passed from it, but my mom's mom was in remission, who I was really close with. And so when they said that, my biggest fear going into that conversation was, oh, her cancer's back. And so when they told us they were getting a divorce, my initial reaction was honestly just relief, because I was like, oh, like grandma isn't sick again. And so it kind of, this weird thing looking back where it was like, oh, my parents told us they were getting divorced, and I was like, oh, phew. But it was just kind of one of those interesting things where I feel like I didn't process it in that moment, but that was kind of the lead up to kind of give some background, I think, on my parents that would be helpful. My dad grew up Catholic. My mom didn't really grow up strongly attending church. And when they got married and had kids, there wasn't a strong religious push behind it. And we went to church kind of growing up just to kind of experience it for ourselves, let me and my brother make our own decision. So I think for both of my parents, kind of over time, I think partly because my dad's traveling so much, the purpose of their marriage very much became their kids. And they did an amazing job of being the parents of their kids. They lived so sacrificially. They gave countless time, resources, everything was always putting me and my brother first. And I think when that was the purpose of their marriage, they did incredible. But I think once I turned 18 and I wasn't around anymore, that thing that had become their main focus in their marriage, I would say, wasn't there anymore. And I think just for some background, I was about 13 or 14 when my mom had told my dad that she wanted to get a divorce, but they had stayed together to wait until I was 18, just so we didn't have to deal with custody or things like that. My brother also was only 16 or 17 at that point. So that was a lot of information. But.
So tell me, before this, so you had moved out and then you come back and you find this.
Yep.
Any idea? Because you said she'd kind of made up her mind when you were 14.
Yep.
Did you see any signs or anything? I know you mentioned your dad's sleeping in a separate room, but did you really, as a kid, you maybe just didn't think much of that? Or
Yeah. I think it's interesting because like looking back, it's like, oh, in some ways this feels really obvious. Like probably the biggest sign that would have been there was my dad sleeping in the guest bedroom. But I think partly like when he's not home a ton, and even when he was home, like they were never like super argumentative or things like that. They'd, bicker, as I think is probably common with most married couples. And so I would say, since I didn't really have any frame of reference of like, oh, this is what, maybe this looks wrong. Like it was just like, yeah, this is marriage. This is what I see in my house. And I don't have a ton of other things to compare this with. I think I felt probably completely unaware of it. It was just kind of like, yeah, this is how things are, and didn't give it much thought. I think probably I just had a lot of other priorities, whether that was my own life, school, sports, all those things.
Yeah.
And I think a couple things that maybe that I picked up from your story. One is like your parents doesn't seem like they were necessarily like following Jesus at that moment, like when they got married or serious about their relationship with Jesus. And so I think in having this conversation, there's an important, I guess, dichotomy to bring up when, marriage is a part of our culture. Like it's a legal binding that, you get married and there is custody battles, there is shared health insurance, there's financial things, all those things that come into play. And I think one of the key differences sometimes we don't talk about in the church between, marriage, and it's a beautiful thing. We think it's God's idea, is the difference in, okay, your relationship is between spouses. You're committed to one another. And in the church, as we talk about it, it's not just the spouses, but to God. It's a covenant under God. It's a relationship between man, woman, and God. So I think part of that is a good, like the accountability for, what somebody understands marriage as, I think is pretty critical in like understanding that conversation and how you hold people to maybe a standard or not a standard and things like that. But it does sound, like there was a lot of sacrifice, for the sake of kids, because there are a lot of marriages. A lot of marriages end in divorce. I think the statistics are, about 50% of marriages end in divorce. And most of them happen way before this, point. Most people aren't amicable enough to even coexist or co-labor together for the sake of, of their kids, which I think is an honoring thing. But it seems like maybe it was more of a co-parenting dynamic than a marriage at at some point, especially those last few years after she decided to get a divorce. So I think those are just as you're sharing that story, some of the thoughts that initially pop into my mind. So I'm curious, as you are thinking about this, like how did that feel? Like did you have other friends whose parents were divorced, or was there like a feeling of like this was all a fraud? Like these dynamics that I grew up in, your marriage was just a fraud, or like did you wrestle through some of those kind of questions of like how do I trust you all again and things like that, I guess?
Yeah. In terms of like close relationships with me, most of my friends had not experienced divorce. I had one close friend whose parents were divorced, and they had gotten divorced when he was super young. And so a very different situation in that sense too. But I remember kind of, I think, in line with that initial reaction of, oh, good, my grandma isn't sick. I just felt a lot of like, looking back, I would say numbness, but it was very much a like, okay, I've been a believer now at this point for a little over a little over 2 years at that point. And like was walking closely with Jesus and had this reaction of like, oh, everything's fine because like Jesus is on the throne and he's going to work and restore and redeem everything. And so like, it's fine. It doesn't matter that this is happening. Like it'll all be okay. And so while like I had friends like whose parents were divorced or like, yeah, this sucks. Like, and like, I'm really sorry, things like that. I was like, oh, like it's fine. I think just having walked through a lot of just negative emotions and kind of dealing with depression and things like that my freshman and sophomore year of college or high school before I came to know Jesus, I had a strong aversion to feeling negative emotions. And so when something came up that was like, oh, I could see how this would trigger a lot of negative emotions and I don't want to go there, it very much became a like, oh, well, this is fine. Like, I'll be okay. That doesn't really matter, I think was kind of my initial reaction. And so it was definitely very much a numbness, but it was like oh, it's okay. Like Jesus is on the throne and reigning. And that's true, but it didn't mean that I didn't need to engage with my emotions.
Process it, yeah.
And then you had that conversation. It sounds like you went back to college. So what was that transition like for you? Were you able to process once you were like out of the house? again, or what's that? What was that like?
It was so interesting. Like looking back, that like within a week of each other over that winter break, like I had a rough first semester of college, just getting adjusted after having a great summer of interning at a church and being like, I want to do this forever. And right now, like within that week, I was in the hospital. My parents got divorced, and I got braces for the second time. And so just what every 18-year-old wants. And so that was rough. And then coming back, I was very angry at God, and I was very confused. But I didn't realize I felt that way because I had just been numbing myself. And so I went back to school with this focus of like, oh, I'm gonna really focus on evangelism this semester. I'm gonna just really, and what that meant was, okay, I'm not going to go to church. I'm not going to hang out with the people that are like walking with Jesus. I'm not going to go to small group, things like that. I'm going to make new friends that aren't believers, and I'm going to hang out with them all my time, and I'm going to call it evangelism because, again, it's kind of one of those like self-coping, convince myself that what I'm doing is like okay mechanisms. And so I came back to college really angry at the Lord, really confused, and not realizing that I felt that way, and making decisions that were essentially me trying to run from God and rebel from him because I just was like, why is this way?
So working your way back, what did that process look like of healing, I guess, when you actually got into it? I mean, it seems like you're far enough removed now that you're able to identify that. So what did the healing process look like? Yeah.
So after like going back to school in beginning of January, around late February, early March was spring break. And so I think, I'm not really sure why I went on the trip, but every year my area of campus ministry, we kind of split up by area. We would go on spring break trips together. And I think partly just I had gone on spring break trips with my church the last 2 years in high school. And I think partly I didn't really want to go home. I decided to go on this trip. And so after having not really been involved for the whole semester, I was like, all right, we're going on spring break. And so what that was it was a week of being in a cabin in Smoky Mountains in Tennessee with like 40 other people that I had been good friends with and hadn't really seen much lately. And a lot of that was like spending time worshiping and in small groups. And it was in that time just processing and sharing and having people speak into my life that they were kind of like, hey, I don't think that you've dealt with this, and I don't think that you're okay. So that was the first time where I was like, oh, yeah, maybe I'm not okay. And so that was just foundational to be like, yep, this is an issue in my life. This is something that I haven't dealt with. And if I'm going to walk in health, if I'm going to walk with the Lord well, I need to go through this. And so that started that process. But it wasn't until that summer, I did a leadership training program in Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is, with my church, and was in a small group with 5 guys who were all good friends of mine, and got the chance just to like really focus in on like, I want these 3 months to be dedicated to processing all my emotions with my parents' divorce. Where do I see Jesus working to restore and redeem? And how can I come to peace with this? And so in that line of healing, probably the most impactful thing for me was the shortest verse in Scripture, which is Jesus wept. And it was so profound for me because like looking at the story of Jesus with Lazarus, like Jesus knows he's going to resurrect Lazarus. Like he knows all that he's going to do, that everything's going to be okay, but he still takes the time to weep and mourn. And as I read that, as I processed what that meant for my life, I was like, if Jesus knows everything is going to be okay, in some ways even so much more than I do, but yet he still takes the time to weep and mourn and lament, how much more so do I need to do that? And so that was really the foundational thing for me to say, okay, this is the result of brokenness. This is just the reality of living in a broken world. And as much as it is true that Jesus is going to make everything new and make everything perfect, we do need to lament the things in our lives that are just the experience of brokenness.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I mean, I think at the end of, most divorces, there's this tendency to pick sides, right? Like that if something fractured or something was broken, then somebody's at fault. And I think most people are self-aware enough or aware enough of a situation to know maybe it's not all somebody's fault. There are definitely times where, divorce is fully one-sided, abusive, things like that. But most people are, okay, I recognize maybe a little more fault of this person, less of this one. So how did you deal with, the dynamics of, the blame game, or how did it change your relationship with each parent, like acknowledging who's to blame, how did this fall apart, and how do I treat each of them, moving forward?
Yeah. In terms of how I saw it change my relationship with both my parents, I think it was like drastic. I think part of that is like I had turned 18 now, and so I was out of the house, and so in some sense dynamics were shifting because I wasn't living under their roof and I'm becoming an adult in the process of doing that. But I think also just growing up in a house where we didn't spend a ton of time like really talking through emotions, talking about really real things. This kind of felt like in some ways like the Band-Aid's just been ripped off and we now have this thing that we can't really avoid. We can't not talk about it. It's very evident and clear and in front of us. And it felt like my relationships with both my parents became so much more like, I wouldn't necessarily say like friend to friend in that sense of I think there were still good boundaries of like parent-child, but it became so much more like we talk about real things and I have more of a window into what they're experiencing and what they're feeling and the hurt that they've been both carrying that I was completely oblivious to, which was probably healthy for a 14-year-old to be oblivious to, but I had no idea. And I think for me also, like having walked with Jesus for those last 2 years, I was experiencing, okay, what is it like for me to be vulnerable as well, to like have a sense of my emotions and be able to share those. And so I think those things combined just led to those dynamics with my parents shifting so much from like sheltered child. We don't really talk about anything. I live under the roof. They care for me really well, but like that's kind of about it to like, we actually talk about things now. I think the thing that was hard for me with like, oh, who do I blame? Was, I mean, in a very real sense, like the divorce was my mom's decision. But my mom was also like who I was the closer with. Like we did everything together growing up. We rooted all of my favorite sports teams were because they were all of her favorite sports teams. And so we always watched Nebraska together because she went there. And we always watched the Yankees. That's probably a less popular one. But
I like the Yankees.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear it, Eric. But all these things where it was like we were really close. And so that was actually one of, if there was like a moment in time that I remember best from the situation, it was that summer as I'm beginning to like really process and come to peace with it. I just remember I was out at dinner with my mom and she had just shared like really vulnerably and open with me of between like me starting to walk with Jesus and then like me finding out about like her decision to divorce my dad, just how worried she was that I would want nothing to do with her. Like we had been so close growing up my whole childhood. She was like my best friend. And she just shared really openly and vulnerably like how afraid she was of that. And so in a sense, like I don't blame either of my parents because I think how they viewed a lot of the marriage and what became most important to them, like they excelled at. Like they made, I mean, not to brag too much, but they made like 2 excellent children who have been really successful and have always felt really loved and cared for by them and know that they can go to them with anything. And so like in some ways I don't blame either of them and just blame the reality of like the brokenness of the world. But it was something where it felt like, okay, yeah, and just like the Band-Aid has been ripped off and we talk about things now in a way that we hadn't before. And I get to see more vulnerability from my parents and in turn get to share more vulnerability with them myself.
Do you think your dad had, like, what were his feelings? You know, knowing it was probably pretty clear that you were closer to your mom since he was out of town more and you had that relationship. Do you think he feared like that you were going to, I mean, kind of the same thing that she was fearing, that you would reject her? Do you think he felt like that, or did you guys ever have those conversations?
Yeah, to my recollection, it's not a conversation we ever had, Dad. If we did and I forget about it, I'm sorry. But yeah, I don't think that was something that we ever talked about a ton. Yeah, I think it was just one of those things where I don't know how much our dynamics changed. In some ways, we saw each other a lot more because around that time, both my parents were beginning to retire. My dad did retire. And that summer, actually, when I was really processing my parents' divorce, I was actually living with my dad, who had rented a house in Ann Arbor, and a couple of my future roommates. And so in some sense, I started to spend a lot more time with my dad even after that. And so I think in some ways that helped heal whatever chasm may have been worried about forming.
Gotcha.
I think also, I just want to point out, even like from a therapist perspective, that the way that you have handled this situation you've been very mindful and acknowledging your feelings and processing it. And I think a lot of people we need to like almost pause and like reflect on how you have been mindful and acknowledging. And like, there's things that worked when you were that age that have brought healing to you so that you're not carrying that into adulthood or later. And so I just think being vulnerable, and I think I hear like communicating and finding people that you trust and being able to receive feedback and let people speak into your lives or into your life is such a good example of processing a trauma like divorce. And so I just want to just point that out for people that are listening to, and just for you. I mean, it's really good the steps that you've taken up to this point to do that. What other ways have you seen that Jesus has been redeeming the situation or bringing more healing for you?
Yeah. I think along those lines of the increased vulnerability, I think far and away the biggest thing, and I don't think like this was the sole reason why it happened, but I think in large part, like the increased vulnerability of even me sharing what it's looked like for me to walk with Jesus, what I'm processing, what I'm feeling, why I've become a believer after like not really growing up as one. Just have seen both my parents. I think my dad kind of come back to Jesus, and I think my mom for the first time really desire to follow Jesus, which has been like, in some ways it's like Jesus has restored and redeemed in the sense of like both my parents know Jesus now, and that feels like so much better than I ever could have expected when I was that 18-year-old in my bathroom being like, oh, everything's going to be fine. Like have seen Jesus do exceedingly and abundantly more than I ever could have expected. And I think the thing that I feel with that too is like, I know that's not a lot of people's story. Like their parents get divorced even maybe when they're 18 and they're like, I haven't seen Jesus move at all. And like, I don't know how he's moving and working. And that's really hard. I think I have the privilege in some ways of like, Jesus has made it abundantly clear how he has been working, to just create really close relationships with my parents, to bring them to know him. And so, yeah, I think it's hard for people that have walked through divorce and they don't know, like, how is Jesus working? Like, is there a light at the end of this tunnel? Is this just brokenness? And that's how it's going to be. And so I think in those lines of like, as I've seen Jesus redeem, just like trusting Jesus's character, I think that's probably been the biggest thing that I've seen is just his steadfastness. Yep, that's the right word. And faithfulness. As I've both like dealt with my emotions, but also in all the time where I didn't want to and where I just repressed them and pushed them away, like Jesus was so steadfast and faithful with me. And to know like, even if I hadn't seen Jesus redeem in like a really clear way where it's evident in my life, like I would know that Jesus was the same. And so I think in some sense, my encouragement to people who just haven't experienced that, who are questioning like, how is God working in the midst of this? Or like, is he really at work? Like, does he desire to restore and redeem? Just like trust Jesus's character, because I think that's been the biggest thing that I've seen over and over as I've walked through this, as I've had the times of, I'm processing this and people are pointing me to Jesus and I'm in the word and I'm seeing it, and the times of like, this continues to be hard and new things get brought up and I'm still trying to navigate and I feel confused and hurt and annoyed sometimes. But just like seeing Jesus always meet me in that, even when I haven't always wanted to be there with him.
That's good. So you went to Ann Arbor, state school, things like that, and the Lord was working in your life, and here you are working in ministry. So how did that transition happen? Like, what made you decide, hey, I'm going to go into this? Obviously, I would assume, being raised in a home that wasn't, always involved in church, like when you were filling out the little things in kindergarten, like being in ministry, being a pastor was not the thing that you're filling out.
Yep.
I'm going to guess, we should have all guessed what Jarrett wanted to be when he was a kid, but
I think you still can.
We don't want to. I think you wanted to be a dentist.
Okay. Jess?
That's how I guess.
Eric?
This is a far right turn.
I'm going to guess firefighter.
Okay.
Oh, I'm going to guess a railroad conductor.
Wow. There were 3 things that I think over the course of my childhood I wanted to be, and none of them were those 3. Okay. But as a young child, I think probably pretty classic boy that was in sports, I wanted to be a professional athlete. I don't think that's going to happen for me at this point, but if anyone's out there and they got a connection, give me a call.
A specific sport?
I was like, if I could make it pro in any sport, I was willing to pursue that. Okay. I didn't have too much. I would have been okay with any of them. Then I wanted to be a teacher for a while. I think mostly because I really liked how like the teachers that would give desk tables points and they would award them points, and then the table with the most, and it just felt like a lot of power. And I think I was really drawn to that. And then kind of in high school, I wanted to be a journalist. And so my plan was to go to Northwestern and major in sports journalism. And so that was kind of the route I wanted to go, because I'd always loved to write. But to answer your question, the initial one, in coming to know Jesus, I saw him take a lot of those passions for like writing and just like being with people and communicating, and foster within me a heart for ministry. I can share this briefly, but in high school on those spring break trips, I went to Haiti twice. And through those trips, just like the Lord had laid it on my heart, like, this is the most rewarding thing. This is what I want you to do for the rest of your life. And so I had been a Christian for about 6 months, and I felt like the Lord called me to pursue ministry. And I was like, sure, let's do it. No idea what that really meant for my life. No idea that it would kind of become my entire life, but just felt so clearly from the Lord that was where he was leading me, and wanted to be obedient to that. And so going into college, I've always kind of said my education was in some ways a series of compromises between me and my parents. My parents had always, growing up, they're always, as two people who didn't love their jobs. They were very successful, but they didn't necessarily enjoy them. They were like, we want you and your brother to do like something that you love, something that doesn't necessarily feel like work. And so knew I wanted to go into ministry. They weren't necessarily like the most thrilled about that. I think then to this day, they still worry about it financially, all those things. But I think in some ways, they've really come around to it a lot. But in that, my education being a series of compromises, it was like, okay, I'll go to the University of Michigan because my parents want me to go there. It's pretty cheap. My brother's already going there, cheap relatively, being a state school, and I had some scholarships and whatnot. And so I was going to go to Michigan, but I was going to major in psychology because that felt the most related to ministry. And then it was like my dad wanted me to get a business minor, and I said, okay, then I'll also get a religion minor. And so that kind of became my process of college. But going into college, I knew ministry was what I wanted to pursue. Even though I wasn't going to a Christian school, that maybe would have made the most sense in terms of pursuing that.
So Jess already kind of mentioned the example that you've set as processing this well, or at least in that time and up until this point. But how do you see that process continuing? Do you because it doesn't seem like it's any type of scenario where there's grief involved. It doesn't always seem, it's very rare for there to be a finish line, I guess is what I'm saying. There's not like, oh, okay, we reached the finish line, now I'm over it. How do you see yourself processing it today and going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think like you're saying, kind of true with a lot of areas of grief is I think I've seen that process not at all be linear, that there's been times where it's been really good, and I feel like I've seen a lot of growth and healing, and been like, oh, like, and even I think the event itself, my parents' divorce, I feel like, oh, I've seen a lot of healing in that. But in that process of grief, like things also get brought up as like life continues, as like I grow up and move, and things like holidays come up, and my parents like had a desire for us to continue to do holidays together, that like our whole family would continue to be together. And so even processing my emotions with that of like, often this feels weird. Like my parents are divorced and the four of us are together for Christmas, like, which I think was, again, I think a really sacrificial thing by my parents to want like their children to just experience normalcy in that sense. But it also brought up a lot of emotions for me of like, this does feel weird a lot of the time, and I don't know what to do with that. And again, I don't have a frame of reference of like putting that against something. And then even through all that process of like, my mom hasn't dated at all since. She had no desire. But for my dad, who started dating again, like, how do we navigate that? And my dad was always pretty hesitant to talk about it, just because I get that. I mean, it'd be kind of awkward to talk about with your children. And how do I feel about that? And how do I process that? And that brings up different things. And then kind of through that process, my dad is now getting remarried. And so that brings up all these things of like, I'm super happy for him. And I don't think I feel any sort of negative emotions in that, but it does bring up things of like, I have to kind of constantly ask myself the question of like, am I okay with this? Or am I kind of numbing myself in the same way that I've just seen myself do historically? And so, yeah, even stepping into officiating his wedding that I'll be doing next fall is like something that it was like, my dad asked me and I was like, I need time to process this. Like, I can't give you an answer right away because it does bring up so many things. And like have so much love for my dad, and he's like amazing, and I look up to him in so many ways. But also like, is this healthy for me? Is this right for me to do? Even how does that impact my relationship with my mom? All these questions where I'm like, I don't know the answer to these, and I don't know who I can ask that would give me the answer to these questions.
There's not a playbook for that one.
Yeah, it's not like a commonly talked about topic. But it's become this process of, okay, grief is arising at different points, and I'm not always sure when it's going to come and what to do with that. And so it's been this event of like, yeah, there was the event of their divorce when I was 18, but in the last 7 years, like different things have come and gone. And I'd like to think I've done a good job of dealing with that, but I think there's probably things I've overlooked and things I continue to deal with and just see ramifications of in my own life.
Yeah.
So with different things like that coming up, and I just think back to your a couple minutes ago when you're talking about just leaning into the characteristics of God. What characteristics of God, as you still continue, I mean, after this has happened years ago, what do you still lean into, or what are the aspects of God that and his character that are most helpful for you, or maybe someone else that's going through this?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing has been the Lord's unchanging nature. He's the same yesterday, today, forever. I think in like seeing in my mom, probably the biggest negative consequence of my parents getting divorced when I was 18 versus when I was 2 or 3, or even when I was 13 or 14, was in those formative years of like high school and where I'm looking, like my frame of reference for what marriage is, my idea of like, this is it. Like, this is the people I'm spending all my time around. This is my main example of marriage, was 2 people that, like, in a very real sense, weren't married anymore. And so, like, I just saw so many negative consequences of, well, how I saw marriage was not a functioning marriage. It was 2 people that were going to be getting divorced. And I've seen so many ramifications of that and thought in my life of, I'm also reaching that age now where, like, oh, I'm starting to care about girls and girls are starting to care about me. And I like, it feels fun and nice. But then I'm like, marriage, dating, like, I don't want these things because like my picture of it is negative and both my parents are divorced. And so it's become this like cycle of like, would my life actually look any different? And so for me, not even for 4 years, 5 years to not even recognize like that I was feeling that way. And then even in processing and like hearing from my mom of, I don't know if I've, ever gotten the full story, but just of like her kind of just slowly just kind of drifting away in her feelings and me seeing that in myself. And just kind of that, like, just that changing of emotion, which I think is natural, but just like that fear within me, had a lot of fears of like, oh, I like relationships with girls, but I don't know if I want marriage because my image of it has become pretty broken and skewed. And so the characteristic of God in his unchanging nature of like, he is like steadfast and faithful and the same, I think has been something where I've wrestled with. How would my story look different than like other people in my family? And just like knowing like, yeah, Jesus being present and the Holy Spirit moving and working in me and my potential future spouse. Like, I think like seeing Jesus' unchanging nature is kind of the practical answer to how would my story look different were I to get married and things along those lines.
I think, yeah, that's fascinating. I think one of the great things, and thank you for just the vulnerability and coming in and sharing your story. And I think one of our hopes when people hear stories is they're able to say, yeah, there's somebody else going through something similar to what I'm going through. But the negative sometimes can be that it becomes prescriptive. Like, oh, this is Jarrett's story and my story needs to follow that same way. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is, an individual story and someone else might have some kind of different thoughts, or maybe, this happens in another family's life, but there were underlying issues, for their parents getting divorced or whatever. But what would some advice, that you would give maybe both ways, like to parents, that are making a decision or in that kind of, life stage where they're processing, hey, we've kind of decided this and, but we're going to wait for 5 years. What kind of advice would you give them about how should you do that? How would you handle it? And what kind of advice would you give, kids or children of those being divorced at that age on how to navigate those relationships?
Yeah. I think for parents, and it's hard because in some ways, like, I don't know what I don't know. And so I don't know like what things would have looked like if they'd been different. But I think the thing that was the hardest thing for me that I saw the most just negative ramifications from was my unawareness towards the situation, and just having an incorrect view of what was happening. Like my image of marriage being formed by people that I thought were married and functioning in a marriage and all those things. And so I think it's hard because, again, even like parent situations, like there's probably not a ton of divorces that are as amicable as my parents were.
For sure, yeah.
And so like in most situations, like if parents are wanting to get divorced at 13, like they're probably like, there would probably be a situation where there's like custody and they're dealing with a lot of different things. And again, it's hard for me to know what would that have looked like in my life? What would that have been like? But I think just trying to be open and communicating. I think it's a fine line and it's hard to walk. But I think just and maybe the part of that's on me, but just like my in some ways complete lack of awareness towards what was happening, I think was where I saw the biggest ramifications, as I was a very impressionable 15, 16, 17-year-old who's trying to answer all the big questions of life and have a sense of like, this is what these different things look like, and this is how life is, and this is how I navigate these things. But yeah, I mean, so I think being as open as possible, but it is really hard. Like there's no, I don't think there's any right answer of like, how do we navigate brokenness perfectly? Because I don't think you can navigate brokenness perfectly. And so, but I think just trying to be as open as possible. And for someone who's walking through it themselves, I think probably even taking it a step further than like the old, like it's okay to not be okay. I would even say like, it's not okay to be okay. I think I've seen that in my own story, but I think that's true for anyone. Like if you're walking through brokenness in any sense, if grief, whether that's a parent's divorce or something completely different, if you're like, oh, I'm fine, that's probably not healthy. Maybe there's a few situations, but I think that's probably one of the more prescriptive things is like, you need to at least have the openness to process, to walk with Jesus and walk in community to be like, what am I feeling? What is happening in my life? How am I experiencing brokenness and grief? And how do I process those things in a healthy way? Because when we experience brokenness, like we shouldn't be okay. Like it should break our heart in a sense. We should feel the weight and the hurt of that. And we should like take it to Jesus and take it to trusted friends and mentors and be like, this is a reality in my life and it sucks. And I don't want to be okay. Like I want to experience healing and I can't do that if I repress it.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Well, I think that's great. I think that advice is good too. And I think Alex, kind of like you mentioned, like it can't always be prescriptive. And I think the circumstance of their divorce is different than, a lot of there's not abuse involved. There's, things like that where it can't be prescriptive. But yeah, Jarrett, thank you for your time and thanks for being vulnerable and sharing this. I think it's helpful for people to digest and probably on both ends of it, people who've gone through something like this. And maybe people who are trying to understand, how does this happen? Or how did you not know? Or how did, I think people have legitimate questions when they haven't experienced it. And so this can be very eye-opening. Do you have anything you feel like you didn't share with us that'd be helpful? Or I think we covered a lot of bases. I just want to give you a moment here if you had any other random final thoughts.
Yeah, I think I hit on this a little bit. But I think just the biggest thing that I've taken away from my story is just like how good Jesus is. Like in the midst of all the brokenness that I've experienced in this and everything else, like have seen him just meet me in the midst of it. Maybe in ways I didn't want, maybe in ways I felt like I was ready for. Yeah. But I've just seen him be so good and so faithful. And yeah, like there's no way that I could have walked through it and felt like I was in a place where I was understanding what was happening if it wasn't for like the work of Jesus to restore and redeem and make all things new. And so that's probably been the biggest thing. It's just been the joy that I've seen Jesus take out of heartache and brokenness. Yeah, great. All right. Thanks again, Jarrett. Yeah. And if anyone is listening and has any questions or concerns, comments, you can reach out to us by emailing us at podcast@cccomaha.org. You can reach out to us on social media on TikTok or Instagram at CCCOMA Podcast, or leave us a voicemail at 402-885-9930. We'd love to hear from you. But until next time, we'll talk to you then.